So yesterday we looked into the proem of the secret doctrine, and as you saw, it's not all that difficult once you go through it once. I'm glad no one's disagreeing. So, except for the second and third fundamental propositions, number 2 dealing with periodicity, and number 3 dealing with the fact that all life is an aspect of the universal oversoul. And H.P. Blavatsky utilized that term from the teachings of Emerson, of course, who was strongly influenced by the Vedanta tradition. In the second aspect regarding periodicity and also the idea of the oversoul, it touches on the fact that all life is a part of this universal one life. And in fact, every life is really a conglomeration of much smaller lives. Even within our own physical bodies, every aspect of our body, whether it's a mineral, whether it's a cell, a virus, a bacteria, all of these are small independent lives which actually come together as part of our one life, our individuality as a human being. And in fact, in the 19th century, a number of scientists were convinced that if they weighed a person just before they died and then weighed them again just after they'd passed away, they could determine the weight of the soul. But this would have to be an extraordinarily fine, very fine determination, because we are all a conglomeration of very small lives. But there is something within our hearts which actually is also a life that does not remain with the body when the body passes away. There is an ultimate atom on each plane that is connected through the suchatma, the thread, if you like, that connects to the higher principle within the human being, that of Atma Buddhi. And it is that which is, if you like, the magnetic center around which all of these small lives coagulate during life, and in which, at the end of life, simply disperse and go their separate ways. And HPD said that we are never more alive than when we have died, given that all of these small lives are now in full complete activity. So bearing that in mind, that everything is life, we're just going to start now to have a look at the manifestation of that life. And these are diagrams taken from some of the early theosophical literature, but they're still great diagrams, as long as we remember that they're just representations to help us to understand the nature of manifestation. And the clearer our thoughts are, because it's very important that we manifest thoughts, including those on the higher planes, the clearer our thoughts are, the more use we can be in the field of occultism and also in the progress on the spiritual path. So in the secret doctrine, she spends a great deal of time looking at the stanzas of Xian and going through the manifestations of the unfolding of life and the beginnings of manifestation itself. But this diagram goes a little bit further than that and picks up at a slightly later period. You have all of the different planes in nature, the physical plane being the lowest, the astral, the mental, which represents a kind of duality, the Buddhic plane, nirvanic, monadic, and the divine or Adi plane, Adi meaning first. The first unfoldment of life is taking up what is sometimes referred to as the holes in space. If you remember, it is Fohat, the bridge between the spiritual and the material. Fohat, that is the power that enables life to take the building blocks of nature, the various atoms from the highest ultimate atom to the lowest, and to actually build the foundation, the planes in nature. The gradation of Svabhavat, that which is self-becoming, the one substance into all of the different planes and subplanes. And in doing this, it begins with the process of taking these ultimate atoms from the highest plane, and we're told that the two highest planes had already been pre-existing and was created by a much greater logos than our solar system. I use the term logos because it has less implications than the term God does for some people. And of course, it is from the Platonic teachings where logos was utilized by Plato as a name for the great divinity. Now, logos is also the basis, because it means word and it means reason. It is also the basis of the Christian teachings as well, especially the doctrine relating to St. John, where he said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God." That word is a translation of logos. Likewise, too, in the East you have vak, and the different degrees of vak, which is also the sound and the word of the Eastern system. And you have the vak that is the unmanifested, that which is manifest, that which represents the wisdom of life, and that which is the mundane, everyday vak or word. And of course you have the Latin verbum, also meaning word. And not to mention the voice of the silence, which also touches on a similar idea, the fact that there is that which utters the word or the sound. In fact, the universe is really built on sound. And it's not surprising, given that the idea of spirit means breath. The idea of pneuma means breath as well. Again, you have this utterance that is described. Now, the third logos is the first to manifest the tattvas, the different planes in nature. And the first two planes, as I mentioned, are said to have already been constructed of these bubbles, which are called atoms. Now, interestingly, they are referred to as bubbles of koilon in occult chemistry and holes in space dug by Fohat in the Secret Doctrine, but essentially the same aspect. And it gives the appearance of being a bubble, but it's described as being a little like taking, say, a stick of incense with a lit end and swirling it around really quickly so it gives the illusion of a circle. As a result, this bubble is really a vortex in motion that gives the appearance of a bubble, but it is much closer to the idea of something like a string. Yet, on the other hand, it is force in motion and is neither the string nor the bubble, but something much smaller than that, which is the unification of the absolute and Mula Prakriti. And Mula Prakriti is that which surrounds the absolute. Now, that's the highest ultimate atom. It takes, in order to create the different planes in nature, it's said that the third logos draws in these atoms and produces, if you like, or breathes out a conglomeration of atoms that produces a much denser atom or unit that produces the second plane in nature, and so on through all of the different planes, so that by the time we come to the ultimate atom, the highest atom on the physical plane, it is composed of nearly 14,000 million ultimate atoms from the Adi or first plane. So that gives you an idea of how fine the matter is. And as we progress through the different planes, each of those atoms is not only smaller, but much further apart. Consequently, this is why we can walk around in this room and pass through the astral condition, pass through the mental condition, and even the nirvanic and the higher planes, because it is all around us and within us. We are inseparable. And if we talk about other dimensions, there is no other space or other location. It is simply all here and now. But there are different dimensions. The astral plane is sometimes referred to as the fourth dimension. The mental plane is the fifth dimension. And it was described in this way. Imagine, if you like, the idea of a line, and say this was a creature, and the line had no conception of a third dimension or a second dimension in space. The idea of a right angle extension to it, so that you have a length and a breadth. And then again, if you imagine that sheet, even though it's impossible not to have a three-dimensional sheet, but say it was two-dimensional, again had a right angle coming out from that, producing a full three-dimensional thing. The two-dimensional creature would have no idea of the three-dimensional, and likewise we as three-dimensional creatures struggle to understand what the fourth dimension would be like, because again it's described as being a right angle to our three dimensions. What that right angle is and how it works, I honestly cannot tell you, but I suspect it has something to do with time. So all of these subplanes are formed, and yet the atoms that are used on each subplane, and each atom is a life, remember, must have already passed in a previous life existence, its existence on the previous plane or subplane. So only those atoms that have actually had the experience of earlier planes can actually be utilized in the building of the lower planes. So taking the physical plane, for example, all of those atoms had previously been used in life on the astral plane. And likewise, all of the atoms on the astral plane had previously had experience on the mental plane and so on. The progress of life as it passes through all of these planes. And this forms the substratum, the planes, the field of evolution for the life to unfold in all of its differentiations. In the physical plane, you have the building of all of the elements that we know, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. And in fact, even those also have a correspondence with the different planes. Carbon has a correspondence, for example, and this is found in the secret doctrine, to the body. The idea of oxygen has a correspondence to prana because it's somewhat fiery. Nitrogen has a correspondence to the etheric double, and hydrogen has a correspondence to the astral body. Again, throughout life, there are always these correspondences. And each plane also has a correspondence to the idea of the seven rays that I'm sure some of you have heard about. HPB, as far as I know, was the first one to term the seven rays in the secret doctrine, where she spoke about it briefly there, and a number of other authors have written about it since. So the first plane has a kind of a correspondence with the first subplane in each plane. And the second plane has a correspondence with the second subplane in each plane. And it's said that the difference between occultism and mysticism is the method that one utilizes in relationship to these planes. So an occultist is more likely to progress from the physical to the astral to the mental, the Buddhic and atomic in a singular line as a form of progress. Likewise, the mystic is more likely to reach towards the second subplane in nature, the plane related to love, and through that form a correspondence with the second subplane and the Buddhic plane, and unfold through the power of love and devotion a link. But in the longer term, they will still have to develop an understanding and mastery, if you like, of the mental plane as well. So these are the two fundamental approaches that are often taken by different people according to their temperament. But the third logos, having formed all the planes in nature, having breathed in all of the atoms and then created a new plane forming the seven subdivisions, the seven planes in nature, it is now the work of the second aspect, the second logos, where it begins to form life. And of course, it is one. So life in the beginning is one, and then it forms a gradual subdivision through all of the planes in nature. And it's been said that it is the one that becomes unconsciously many, but then it is the many that gradually, very slowly, and then very consciously come back again to be consciously one. So this is part of the whole process of evolution. And of course, in this process, it reaches around until it finally touches the higher mental plane. Now, what this diagram is saying is that life, through all of its forms, is gradually evolving through the planes in nature, reaching the densest, which we would call the mineral kingdom, and then gradually evolving to reach the plant kingdom, then the animal kingdom, and finally the human kingdom. We have been through all of the past kingdoms in all of our past incarnations. As I'm sure you've heard before, Rumi the poet said that I was a mineral and then I became a plant. I was a plant and I became an animal. I was an animal, then I became a human. And then he speaks about attaining to the spiritual and the divine realms. And then the part that I like is when he says, "When was I less by dying?" Which means in death there is always progress. Now this is where we reach the level of the human being. And it's important to understand that at this point we develop full, if you like, realization of the will aspect. The will, of course, like the other aspects of divinity, is always within us, and it's within the animal kingdom, the plant, the mineral, and so on. There is nothing that does not contain this life, but our self-determination begins in the human kingdom. And this is when we are referred to as the firstborn, because we are the firstborn as human beings, which actually are able to utilize all three aspects fully, the will aspect no longer simply being latent and unrealized, but still always there as a potency. Now this is another diagram that I quite like from the theosophical literature, and it's just to highlight that there is these subtle aspects. You have at the lowest part the mental, astral and physical bodies, as they refer to, which are our personalities. You have something beyond that, which is the causal body. You can see it just in the upper part of the mental plane. The Karana Sarira, referred to as the causal body because it is the generator of causes by coming into each incarnation. It is the first cause for us as a universal soul and manifestation as a personality. And behind that you have the intuitional, the Buddhic aspect, that which represents universal wisdom. And beyond that you have the Nirvanic, itself a trinity in its own plane as well as a unity. And it puts part of itself down into the lower planes just as the Logos does. As to the Hermetic axiom says, as above, so below. But more so, as above is truly reflected below, perhaps not quite the same way as people have tried to anthropomorphize the divine and imagine divinity wearing clothes and having a human face. The reality is that it's a quality that is repeated on the lower planes in nature. Now the mental body, the astral body, the etheric double, the physical body are part of our principles. And this is represented as a quaternary, as a fourfold aspect, a cross, if you like, symbolically, and the higher three aspects are represented as a trinity or a triangle. And the triangle and the cross are the archetypal forms in nature. The triangle representing the spiritual, the pyramid, the three-sided pyramid, and of course the cube representing the form side of life. Now, of course, ancient cultures were always aware of the principle of evolution, and this is also from the Secret Doctrine, and it was part of the Egyptian theory of the soul. From one soul, that of all, spring all the souls, which spread themselves as if purposely distributed through the world. These souls undergo many transformations. Those which are already creeping creatures turn into aquatic animals. From these aquatic animals are derived land animals, and from the latter, the birds. From the beings who live aloft in the air, heaven, men are born. On reaching that status of men, the souls receive the principle of conscious immortality, become spirits, then pass into the choir of gods. Also, you could look at the idea of the 10 avatars as also representing the gradual unfoldment of evolution. So to say that Darwin was the discoverer of evolution and other scientists from his time, he was really the rediscoverer for European culture. But the principles of evolution had long been known in ancient cultures. And there's also a very good book, if you're ever interested, called The Theft of History, which speaks about various ideas in Indian and Asian culture that had pre-existed European discoveries. This is also a diagram from the Secret Doctrine, but in the diagram, HPB numbers the principles from 7 to 1, and she does put in a little footnote that it is much better to number it from 1 to 7. So I've taken the hint and I've numbered it from 1 to 7. 1 being Atma, that universal principle. 2 being the spiritual soul, the Buddhic principle. 3 being the duality of mind, the higher mind, the abstract mind, and the lower concrete mind. 4 being Kama Rupa, the desire body, the emotional astral body. And of course, 4th, 5th, and 6th, and 7th, prana, the vehicle of prana, the etheric double, and the stula sarira. It is a bit confusing that HPB uses the term astral body in a number of different ways in her writings. Even in the Secret Doctrine, sometimes she uses it to refer to the astral body that we know that is the emotional body, and sometimes to the etheric double. So it's important to read the context in which she uses it to avoid confusion. In Christianity, it is the spiritual body that is Atma, the all in all, the Christ within, the Christos. Because Christ, as you know, is a word that simply means anointed. It is the oil that is extracted from the wood, which is interesting because in the allegory, Christ is referred to as a carpenter. Yes, so while my computer is booting up, so the nature of the Christ is it is the oil, the essence that comes from the wood, and allegorically Christ was discussed as a carpenter. The allegory meaning that it is one who works with the wood, one who helps to extract the oil. The oil is always a symbol of the essence behind the form. And it is a title, the anointed one, just as Buddha means the enlightened one, Krishna means the dark one. These are all representing certain aspects of spirituality and have nothing to do with personality. And likewise, in the Christian idea of Buddhi, it is the house not made with hands. Again, the spiritual aspect. The hands are always symbols of the creative aspect of life, just as the head and the heart symbolize the higher will and the higher feelings. Likewise, the hands and feet always symbolize the creative. Hence, the house not made with hands, not associated with mind. And likewise, you have there the Vedantic classification and the classification in the Taraka Raja Yoga system, which was that which T. Subarrow, also an earlier Theosophist and considered to be just as great as H.P. Blavatsky in his knowledge. He was a follower of that system, and consequently, he looked at the principles as a fourfold division, which are listed there. But still, the principles look at the same elements, but they still are, if you like, a combination of the same principal elements. And again, you have the 7 planes and the principles functioning thereon. Atma, or spirit, Buddhi, the spiritual soul. Manas. Manas is also one. Now, the life that holds us together as personalities, the force, is really prana, the pranic life energy. It's sometimes referred to as life, but I find that a bit confusing when you look at the life wave that comes down into manifestation. So it's also called vitality, and I think vitality is a little bit less confusing than life, even though both are interchangeable. Now, the important thing is that these 7 principles, this is from the Secret Doctrine, where you have spirit, the Buddhic principle, mind, both the higher and lower, the higher mind, the animal soul. So Buddhi mind is what HPB referred to as the human soul. Animal soul is the combination of the lower mind and the Kama principle, the principle of desire. And as we're also taught, it is the will that passes into the emotions that gives rise to desire. And that is the principal means of our unfolding the urge to experience life. And it is the Buddhic energies that pass into the lower mind that forms the desire for knowledge. And of course, it is the creative aspect of the higher mind, which passes into the physical body, that creates the urge to be active and to run around. And all of these have their extremes as well. Now, these fundamental principles are listed here from 1 to 7, but in the Secret Doctrine, they also have a correspondence with what HPB refers to as the 7 planets, a chain of worlds of which the Earth is a part. Each principle, the principle of will, if you like, in the first principle, the principle of love in the second, associated with, or wisdom associated with the second, the Buddhic principle, the principle of intelligence and love in the third, and so on. All of these have a correspondence with the 7-fold planets in the planetary division. Our Earth is listed there as the 4th, and it's taught that our Earth is one planet in a chain of worlds. There are 2 planets also on the etheric plane, 2 on the astral, and 2 on the lower mental. Now, this is an important principle because the Logos centers life on each planet one at a time in the unfolding of evolution, and it passes around these 7 planets 7 times, which is why they refer to it as 7 rounds in the theosophical literature. And it passes from the first planet, sorry, this is flickering in front of me, passes around from the first planet to the second, to the third, to the fourth. Now, why is this important? It's important because if we understand that... Thanks. Don't go back to your juggling career. It's important because we're told that all life is one, and surely if all life is one and everything is evolving, we should be able to look out into our solar system and see life on the other planets, but we don't. So it answers that fundamental question, well, why don't we see life on other planets? And when we see lives in other solar systems, we should see some life on some of those planets, but at the moment we can't perceive that life. And this principle, if you take it even as a theory, is very important because it shows that the focus of life is not necessarily on the physical world alone at this time. In fact, it's not, except for our chain of worlds, in which we have passed through 3 previous rounds, and we're now in the 4th round as it's described, reaching this planet Earth. And in this cycle, we've passed through 5 cycles already and 5 sub-cycles. And each one has a correspondence with one of the 7 rays. So the 4th cycle means it's the association with the idea of both the development of the emotions, but was also in this round that the unfoldment of wisdom began because it is associated with the 4th plane in nature, the Buddhic principle. And so it was in this round that the Buddhic principle started to unfold its powers, and consequently it was the midway point through this round that the spiritual path was also opened up, and people were then able to tread the path. So we have this correspondence of the principle of spirits being associated with the first planet. And the same fundamental divisions also occur during life. The first 7 years is the first period where we have the correspondence to the will or atmic aspect. And it is the beginning from ignorance to developing, if you like, the foundational aspect or the building of our bodies physically. In the second 7 years, we have the second cycle, which begins the foundational building of our emotions. In the third 7 years, we have the foundational building of our minds. And of course, those 7 years are the difficult years relating to our teenage years, where the emotions have already been substantially developed, but the mind is very undeveloped and consequently easily overwhelmed by the emotions. In the next 7 years, you have the foundation of the subtle and abstract mind being developed by correspondence. The next 7 years, you have another aspect of mind corresponding to buddhi, or the wisdom aspect, and consequently, the last 7 years, you have the final process of development. But also, there are other cycles happening apart from these 7. There is also, it's said, the 7 rays, which is separate to the development of humanity, that is also unfolding at the moment. And it's said again that the current cycle is the very beginning of the 7th ray cycle, which involves, if you like, the use of magic and ritual. I honestly can't say very much about that because I've only seen it referenced in the literature, but it's just reminding us that there are a number of different cycles all unfolding at the same time. So the first planet has a correspondence with the first principle. The first 7 years of life also has a correspondence with the first principle, and so on. So we can see that there's a pattern unfolding. Not only that, but as we progress through the 7 planets and reach that which is densest, we've worked through the process of involution, and we've developed the form side of life, gradually becoming our individual selves. We're never so individual and material as we are in the middle part of life. And likewise, we begin the ascending journey, which is why she has on the side of that diagram, ascending to spirit. We have the ascending part of the journey of moving from the material back to the spiritual. And we see this sometimes in the various allegories, such as the prodigal son in the Hebrew literature, the one who left the father in the spiritual kingdom, so to speak, passing into the far country, which is the material life, and then having all of life's experiences, yet unable to take all of the material possessions with him, has to leave everything behind, and eventually returns back to the Father and back to the spiritual. And this is the same allegory told in the myth of Odysseus as well, in the Odyssey story. And it's told again and again where a person has had to abandon all of their possessions and arrive back to the spiritual completely naked and completely unattached. So there is this progress. And the same quality also applies during life. In the early part of life, we are, if you like, ignorant. We are at the beginning of our spiritual journey. As we progress down through the correspondences, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th become the most material part in the mid part of our lives. And so it's no accident that we have our greatest conflict in that particular time, because where you have the midpoint, the 4th globe, the midpoint in our individual lives, you have the great battle between the materializing forces that build the form and the spiritualizing forces that help to break down the form and to allow the spiritual life to be released from that form. And they meet in the middle to become equalized. Consequently, this is the time of the great battle between the two. And this is when people are most likely to experience what is sometimes referred to as the midlife crisis. The journey between all that has made them a human being up to that point with all that they can possibly become. And they start to question, where am I going? Who am I? Where is all of this leading me to? And in becoming more spiritual, instead of acquiring things for themselves, they're more likely to give things out. In other words, they're more likely to become the grandparents who are no longer acquiring things as they did when they were younger and building up the family. They want to give everything they have to the family. They want to support the extended family as well. They want to give their time to supporting non-profit organizations, all of these other activities, because they realize there's no longer anything to remain attached to. So they're more willing to become spiritual, and this is also part of this process. And finally, they reach the same stage in the end as they did in the beginning, helpless, a little bit less attractive than a baby perhaps, but just as helpless. And this is, again, all part of the process. H.P. Blavatsky says something very interesting. She says that this pranic energy, which is a universal life energy, this vitality, it is the very force that helps to push back Mula Prakriti to create the spaces within the egg that allows manifestation to occur. It's also allegorically described as a cave in some books, such as in Plato's text, where he refers to the allegory of the cave. The logos, the sun that shines on the people in the cave, producing the shadows on the walls. That cave also symbolizes, if you like, manifested life and all of the life that unfolds within it. And within this pranic energy that holds this force that holds back and creates that space out of mula prakriti, out of matter, it is also the same force that gives us life in the first 35 years of our lives. And she refers to this as the invisible lives, the fiery lives, the life energy, prana, which actually helps to keep us vitalized. Some people say that we begin to die from the moment we're born, but this is not true. It is the pranic energies that keep us full of vital life until around 35 years of age. But then that prana becomes exhausted, and the ability to store and retain prana gradually diminishes, and all of the so-called devouring lives, as she refers to it, all of the microbes, including the subtle microbes on the higher planes, gradually start to diminish our material lives. And in fact, quoting one scientist, she mentions that just as one cell depleted from oxygen starts to take the oxygen from other cells around it, and then gradually the cells start to deteriorate and die, she says the same process also happens with pranic energy. The cells start to draw on the pranic energy from the neighbouring cells, and we get the process of deterioration in the second half of life. But this is also part in the deterioration of the process of release, of allowing the spiritual to leave the material. And even though the body starts to decay, interestingly enough, science also shows that the mind doesn't necessarily decay so quickly. In fact, during this whole process, the mind still continues to develop. In fact, they've shown that the vocabulary of people is actually greater in old age than it is in the earlier part of life, assuming they haven't had some other mental health issue or deterioration. But generally speaking, the mind will subtly improve as one gets older. So even if we're bedridden, we can still think. Yes. 5 minute break.